Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlene Vincent, and I am a senior instructor and serve as the Associate Chair and Field Experience Director in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. I'm also a faculty member of the Master of Arts in Global Affairs program. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, The Impact of Racism on International Crime and Justice Systems. This webinar is brought to you by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Law Series. The recent deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Rayshard Brooks have catalyzed a global phenomenon that not only brings attention to the racial injustices experienced by Blacks at the hands of American society, but of law enforcement in particular. The rallying cries of "No justice, no peace," Black Lives Matter, and most recently, "I Can't Breathe," can be heard north to south, east to west, continent to continent. These hashtags have been plastered on handheld signs, clothing donned by young and old alike, and even the streets upon which we walk, all in the name of shedding light upon racial injustice and police brutality. Under the leadership of President Mark B. Rosenberg, Florida International University has held several town halls, webinars, and even cafecito chats, giving us the opportunity to engage in real talk, to have uncomfortable conversations that address racism, privilege, and diversity, topics that deeply affect the FIU community, the nation, and the world at large. Today's webinar focuses on the impact of racism on international crime and justice. We will begin with a broad overview of race and justice, including the origins of the mistrust of law enforcement, ideas of police legitimacy and police reform, and we'll briefly touch upon mass incarceration and the call to defund the police. To cover these topics, I'm joined by three experts, all my esteemed colleagues from the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Dr. Candace Ammons Blanford is an instructor whose research focuses upon intraracial gun crime and the correlation between race, firearm violence, and police diversity. Dr. Tim Goddard, is an associate professor. His research interests are youth crime policy, youth-led struggles for social justice, and issues of race and class in predicting crime and delinquency. Dr. Robert Peacock is an assistant professor who spent 15 years overseas managing police reform projects for the U.S. Department of Justice and has published extensively on studies on police legitimacy and integrity. But before we begin, I'd like to make one additional announcement. The Master of Arts in Global Affairs program, which is co-sponsoring this event, has extended its deadline for fall 2020 applications. The effect of racism and racial injustices continues to reverberate around the world. A global affairs degree, particularly in the international crime and justice track, can provide you with the needed know-how and skill set to understand these implications and the policy consequences thereof. Before we begin, I'd like to remind our audience members to please send us your questions using the Q&A feature. We'll take as many questions as we can and try to incorporate them into our panel discussion. Dr. Blanford, I'd like to start with you.
Okay.
Can you set the tone for us by shedding a little light on the historical precedent of racism in the criminal justice system and how that's connected to all of the civil unrest that we've seen in the past month?
Absolutely. I think that when we kind of think of this idea of police and systemic racism, right? We have to really be able to kind of contextualize it and see, okay, where did policing start? You know, because we hear a lot of times people say that the police are racist. You know, we hear this term systemic racism, right? And it's like, okay, so how did this happen? You know, and I've had students that are like, I don't understand. How did we get here? How? And for some, I think this is maybe the first real time that they're saying, okay, yeah, there really is a problem, and we really need to address it. But how do we address it? And I think the first thing, as Dr. Vincent said, is we have to look back at the history and kind of how the country was framed as it regards law enforcement. When law enforcement first began, it was slave patrols, right? And essentially those that patrolled were tasked with keeping slaves under control, tasked with, okay, if they see them out, they're not right. They're not supposed to be out. They're trying to run away. Right. So it's this idea of I'm controlling and I'm just going to say it. I'm controlling these Black people. Right. Although they may have perhaps used a more derogatory term. So it was this idea of control. So then we move to we go from slave patrols, right? Then we have Black codes. Then we have Jim Crow. So we have the civil rights movements, which, albeit, of course, have made things better, but it wasn't a panacea. And even when people look in terms of policing, I think a lot of times people are like, well, the civil rights era is over. Those things are over. And the other day I was reading an article and there was this picture and it kind of caught me off guard because it was in black and white. And the only reason I knew that it was a picture of something that recently happened regarding the protests was because I looked at the clothing, right? So I look and I said, okay, I'm looking at the type of clothes that these individuals have on, and I know this is something recent. But it's scary to look and to see even now those pictures that parallel the civil rights movements. And even when we think in terms of law enforcement, things like diversity, when Black police officers were asked to really become part of law enforcement, it wasn't to help protect and serve. It was to help, again, to control these Black people that are out of control. So we have this history, 400 plus years in this country of police being tasked with essentially keeping Black people in line. And so everything was kind of built around that. And so I think that in order for us really to make positive change, we have to first acknowledge where we've been, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Turning our heads doesn't help. Acting as if it didn't exist or glorifying it or making it look more beautiful than it actually is, those things don't help us. The first thing we have to do is say, okay, this is a history. Because, when people, they say, I'm a Black woman, right? I recently traveled to Tennessee, and to be honest with you, I saw police pull behind me, and I'm shaking, literally shaking. And I know I'm not going over the speed limit. I know that I've crossed my T's and I've dotted my I's, and I'm still literally shaking. And by starting with the history of policing and what has transpired, I think we're able to move forward. We can make more meaningful change, and we can also empathize with those people that this is their reality. Because a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm not afraid of the police. I don't understand what's the problem. It's not a big of an issue. It's not as big of an issue as people make it. But when you go back and you look at what has happened, you look at the history there, you can understand and you can empathize with why some people feel, at this point, they don't even want the police around. So we have to start with the history. I know I said a lot to circle back around to that, but we really have to start with the history and what has transpired, because we didn't just get here because of George Floyd. There's a history of police abuse, of deadly force, and this is something that goes back, heck, like I said, hundreds of years. So we have to first deal with that. And until we are willing to say, hey, you know what, this was wrong. Hey, in the past, we didn't handle this correctly. We didn't acknowledge it was there. And I think, as me speaking as a Black woman, that's, I think, what people want to hear. They wanted people just to be honest and acknowledge where we've been.
Thank you. Dr. Goddard,
You're welcome.
in the wake of the recent unrest in Minneapolis and Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and in many cities across the country, across the world, actually, many people are calling for changes to policing to help quell some of the protests, even those protests that initially start off in peace. They start off peacefully. Do you think that changes to policing are enough to combat some of the issues that we're facing today?
I think it's a start, but more needs to be done in almost every area in the criminal justice system. I first want to start though with just something a little bit of a note in that about the reactions and activism, because they're not new and not even in recent memory. I just want to read a quick excerpt from an article that I co-authored 5 years ago. In late 2014, a national conversation in the US developed around police violence, and people have taken to the streets demanding change. Ignited by specific acts of police violence towards young people of color, protests erupted in several US cities, including New York, St. Louis, Los Angeles, and most recently in Baltimore, Maryland, where the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray from spinal injuries sustained while in police custody ignited widespread protests across the city. The demonstrations, sit-ins, die-ins, and the like are demanding reform of the criminal justice system and reintroducing calls to eradicate various social inequalities and upend institutionalized racism. So given that George Floyd's murder and the national and international mobilizations mirror what is taking place just 5-6 years ago, and many protests and movements before that, I really worry that real and lasting change is going to be more challenging to achieve than it seems at the moment. Still, this moment feels a bit different, and activists such as Angela Davis are saying such. But I want to caution everyone about how long the road to justice for all is, and how intractable and difficult injustices are to detect and eliminate. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, argues that as soon as one form of social or racial control ends, another more subtle one takes its place. And this has been the story of the US since nearly the founding of it. So we need to be ready for them. And even today, there are dozens of policies, strategies, and practices of the criminal justice system that needs reform. However, we don't see videos of these, so there are fewer public reactions to them. We don't see, for example, videos of what happens in pretrial arraignment, what cases prosecutors decide to prosecute, dismiss, or divert to community programs. We also don't see the defense counsel conversations with defendants and how limited and often rushed these conversations and defense plans are by the often overworked and overstretched and underpaid public defendants. And yet racial disparity has been found at significant points in the processing of people who get caught. For example, in the seriousness of the charge, the number of companion charges, the length of stay while awaiting trial, and guilty outcomes at trial. We don't or rarely see what is happening in jails and prisons. Over 60% of those imprisoned are Black or brown. Although the numbers change slightly, consistently, 1 in every 106 white men are locked up in the US, while 1 in every 35 Hispanics are. And for Black men, the ratio is astonishingly 1 in every 15. Furthermore, women are the fastest growing prison population in the US, increasing 800% since 1980. And the jail population alone increased over 1,400% since 1970, to where overall Black and Hispanic women are almost 2/3 of the women imprisoned. And we haven't yet seen videos of inmates doing prison labor for wages that are legal in the United States outside of prison walls. Numerous corporations use prison labor, such as Starbucks, Target, Eddie Bauer, to name a few. Inmates, many of whom are Black and brown, staff AT&T call centers for less than $2 per day, or farm fish for Whole Foods for 74 cents per day, or sew uniforms for McDonald's. And the list goes on and on. We don't see videos of formerly incarcerated people who get out of prison and jail and have to scramble to find housing, or how many times they get turned away from jobs because of their record. And for people of color with a felony record, the prospect of finding stable work is nearly impossible. And we don't see enough videos of the children of incarcerated people and how their experiences shape their lives, often in harmful and painful ways. And, you know, speaking of kids, we don't see more than a handful of videos of young kids of color being treated differently and unfairly in their schools, particularly with when it comes to like decisions to suspend or expel them. And take, for example, in 2015-2016 school year, 57% of short-term suspensions in Virginia public schools were for minor nonviolent offenses, including expressing disrespect, walking away from teachers and administrators. And notably, students of color receive a disproportionate number of these kinds of discretionary violations. For example, in 2017-2018, Black and Hispanic students received nearly 85% of all suspensions in the New York City public school system, even though they make up 67% of all school students. And we don't hear much about the invisible punishments, such as curfew enforcement, trespassing enforcement, and all the low-level misdemeanors and status offenses that differentially impact people of color, particularly young people of color. The fines or processing fees that come along with them are very consequential to people without economic wealth to spare. Now, I've focused on the United States, but similar disparities exist elsewhere. Research finds an overrepresentation of Indigenous people incarcerated in Australia. In Canada, Aboriginal youth are overrepresented in the correctional system as well. In 2010, 2011, in the provinces that provided data, Aboriginal youth represented 26% of those sent to custodial facilities, even though they represented only 6% of the total population in those jurisdictions. In Europe, immigrants and foreign-born people suffer the brunt of incarceration. Foreign-born people are imprisoned on average 6.2 times more than EU citizens, with some countries, for example, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Greece, incarcerating immigrants up to 10 times more often than nationals. And much like the US, being Black in the UK exponentially increases the likelihood of being stopped and searched. In the United Kingdom, between 2005 and 2017, the percentage of Black youth in custody doubled from 12.5% to 25.3%, while the rate of white youth in custody dropped from 71.9% to 54%. Therefore, the racial or ethnic disparities in the US criminal justice system are extreme in scale, but not in kind.
Thank you. Let's bring in Dr. Peacock to this conversation. Dr. Peacock, the violence that we've seen against people of color at the hands of law enforcement has sparked a debate on police legitimacy. I know that you lived in Europe for 15 years and do much of your research focusing on police legitimacy and police integrity in Europe and Eurasia. How has the relationship between the public and the police overseas been impacted by social justice and police use of force issues?
Well, Dr. Vincent, I want to first answer that by quoting first Dr. Goddard, who was saying that there's something about this particular time that feels different. And Dr. Ammons was saying how something is wrong and needs to be changed now is the common intuition right now among those here in America. And I think this sort of, this awful incident in Minneapolis, horrific, and in front of us and in front of our very eyes with the video, it definitely across, I've been following criminal justice and social issues for several decades, and I don't recall an issue that has had this kind of cross-society sense that something is very different. And this is not surprising within America, but the fact that what to me is really remarkable is that across the globe, but particularly in Europe, there's a similar sensation. In France, and because of limited time, I'm going to focus on France. Britain certainly compares the most to the United States when you look at the protests and you look at statutes coming down in a lot of the details, and frankly, a lot of the policing as well. But I think really discussing France, you have to look at continental France continental Europe, and France is best representative of that. And I think that it's a place that normally we would never expect a dramatic influence coming from the United States. It's a country that's really gone out of its way to seem quite aloof from problems in America. But recently, when the marches started in France, soon after the homicide in Minneapolis, you had this, at first, a kind of a rejection by the mainstream, kind of the traditional representatives of French opinion, who was kind of saying, well, you know, we didn't have slavery, we didn't have lynching, we didn't have this kind of, segregation laws. But this quickly changed, in part because there's, it's a product, I think, of the feeling, the complete aghast of at that video, but also a feeling among the younger generation in France and among what we think is 15% of the population in France who is non-white. It's actually not allowed to collect that data in France, but they haven't, really changed the conversation completely soon after. For one, France's history is not just within the borders. So when you look at France, and in particular where most of its minority population comes from originally, parts of the French colonial systems, the police was a violent force, and the laws were most definitely discriminatory. There's no denying it, and it's really changed. It's really changed the discussion there. And by chance, they had their own case, Adama. I don't know if Rodrigo, there's an image I have of from France, but throughout the demonstrations there, Floyd is the symbolic representative globally, frankly. But in France, in particular, they've combined those images, and I did have a picture of Adama, and Adama, who's an individual who was killed 4 years ago in amazingly similar circumstances, frankly. The fact that he had fled a scene, and then when arrested, three officers put their body weight on him. He was saying he couldn't breathe. There's no video, obviously, that had an impact on the global implications, but he died later, and at that time the autopsy, the coroner wouldn't allow the family to see Adama, because they said, well, you don't want to see the blood from the mouth. He died of a heart attack. He had a heart condition, and the family said, no, we're not accepting that answer. And they got out and they got their own, quite similar to what happened initially in Minneapolis. They got another autopsy, and the family autopsy showed that it was asphyxia, likely cause. And this has actually been something that's been a subject of protests for the 4 years since. But what has really coalesced in France, and I think in Europe as a whole, is a feeling that even though, obviously, George Floyd does not represent the issues in France or Denmark or anywhere else, but he's become this kind of symbolic change of the conversation. What in France they write as being, they use a phrase, I think it really captures a lot of it. In a lot of the recent publications, they use a phrase called Le Monde Après, which means the world after. That there was, I beg your pardon, I thought I had that on airplane mute. Let me get my screen back up. Apologies. But they thought that they had this, they thought that that just like in the United States, there's this impression across the whole of French society, across different layers of society there, that, as we heard earlier from Dr. Emmons, that something's happened and now something has to change. And this Le Monde Presse, this idea that after Floyd, we don't know what the change will be. And obviously, just like in the United States, throughout Europe, there's, considerable debate, and there's people from different political sides of the spectrum debating these issues. But there's this commonality that something has to be done differently. And to me, it's truly amazing and transcendental in many ways that in these countries with, as I said, France, where they couldn't try harder not to be influenced by America, that, they've really have been grabbed by the same, what I call kind of an intuition, the sense of that this is different. And I hear that from people who represent far different sides of politics in the United States and views on law enforcement. And I think that this is what I'm seeing in France as well. So to finish on France, so the government, feeling this pressure, has quickly moved. They've banned chokeholds. They've done some smaller things, and they have a group that's going to consider additional reforms. But obviously, this is not going to be not going to change the attitude of the protesters or the current dynamic there. They have an election coming up. The far right is doing reasonably well in the polls. So I think the prime minister is making statements that not a statue will come down because he feels it'll cost him in the election. But it's, drawing that line is probably just sealed his fate there, because the protesters, in this case, in France, the statutes have to do with prominent French, those prominent in France's history that wrote what they're called the Black Codes. These are the rules under which the colonial holdings of France were ruled. And this includes, obviously, slavery, includes actually not allowing Jews in those territories. There's all kinds of, there's elements that clearly, if it were inside of France, no one would debate the fact that the statutes and the individuals are inappropriate. But because they kind of have this history within France and outside France, and because France, I mentioned earlier that we don't even know how many non-white French citizens, and I'm not talking about illegals or, any hidden numbers. I'm talking about how many actual French citizens are not white. And it's a secret. Nobody knows because, again, I think in a noble, I think historically a noble manner, France has kind of taken a view of itself as being, colorblind. So if you had universal citizenship, if you were so privileged to made it to France, and certainly I just recently watched a documentary where the Black musicians traveling to Paris in the 1940s and 1950s, is a huge opportunity, not only to just make a living, but to have dignity and to be treated as equal. And so there's parts of this French ideology that, that had its time and had its place. But today, if you're Algerian, you don't want to hear about the fact that you can't get data on how many Algerians or how many minorities of any type have been the victims of the official statistics on excessive force, for example. They have very good statistics in France. They keep track of a lot of the misconduct by the police, but you cannot, it's not allowed under their law to categorize it based on keeping the data based on race or ethnicity. And so in a community that lacks trust, in a community, particularly the 15% of French citizens who have been complaining for years now about biased policing, about discriminatory policing, excessive force, to then tell that community, well, we can't actually reveal that information. It's obviously, it breeds further distrust. So the time and place of French policy, clearly has changed, is going to change. And that's really, for me, it's extraordinary that there's this parallel, that you can find so many countries around the world right now, which are, George Floyd is a symbolic, certainly for those outside America, is a symbolic figure, but they've really internalized what's taken place, and they're having many of the same debates that we are here in the United States. And as you heard Dr. Ammons earlier, what we don't know is what will truly, will the change truly be able to satisfy those who don't trust the agency? So I think that what we really got to think about is fundamental change beyond just what the French and others have considered as first steps. And clearly across Europe and the United States, people are waiting for what exactly Le Monde de Presse will mean. And so I apologize for the length of this response.
Oh, it's quite all right. What a fascinating discussion. Dr. Blanford, as we think about Le Monde Après, the world after, we started to look at this negative attention that law enforcement has received, especially video clips of officers manhandling or assaulting protesters and innocent bystanders. And that's actually resulted in this call to defund the police. Could you explain exactly what defunding the police means?
I sure can. Well, let me just start by saying, so when someone says that we should defund the police, I know I've seen all over social media these hashtag defund the police. And that does not mean that the police will not receive any funding. And I believe, like, I've spoken to several students and they're like, well, we can't just take all the money away from the police. And I'm like, well, no, it doesn't exactly mean that. I prefer the term. So when my students are like, oh, defund police, I prefer, the term we are reallocating. So it's not that funds are completely being taken away. It's that we're reallocating some of those funds to other initiatives that have shown promise, whether that is something like increasing education, or perhaps, if there's a school creating a trek where they, like a technical trek. I was losing my train of thought, like whether we're creating a technical trek, or perhaps giving a single mother some additional training, or perhaps finding those high-risk boys and saying, hey, let's put them in some more constructive programs. It's looking at other ways that we can address the root problem and those social ills. So it's not necessarily just taking away all of the money. It's saying, okay, let's keep this amount for police, and some of these other funds, let's move to other initiatives that have shown promise that can perhaps deal with what is the root that's causing crime. So what are those social issues that we need to give attention to? So, it's more about reallocating funds.
One of the problems that we've seen is that law enforcement over several decades has been tasked with this responsibility of handling social services, if you will, as opposed to the traditional role of policing. Dr. Goddard, in your work, you've studied community-based organizations and social justice agencies, and you've argued how these nonprofit organizations could play a central role in minimizing crime and in affecting the US criminal justice system. First, can you talk a bit more about what these organizations are, what they do, why you believe they're vital to sustaining long-lasting changes in our system? And second, does the push for these types of organizations further support the call to defund the police?
Sure. So yeah, to start, so I've spent a number of years studying what I label more of social justice organizations, and these come out of this move of this neoliberal governance where we turn to the community or nonprofit, the private sector, to deal with or manage a host of social problems that were once the jurisdiction of the government or the state, now is handed off to, like I said, private, either multi-agency public-private partnerships and the nonprofit sector. And then within that are a sliver of a piece of that, and these are more community-based organizations. And many of them, or the ones that work on criminal justice related issues, broadly speaking, because a lot of the work they do are in schools. Me and my colleague and I call social justice organizations, right? And we've come up, I won't go through a whole typology of what they look like, but the one type and the one that we are actually most interested in were activist social justice organizations, right? And these groups often work to build social movements against tough on crime practices. Organizations of this kind campaign against a wide range of policies, including the presence of police in schools, the lack of due process for youth placed on gang watch lists, and even protesting against the construction of new jails. Some of these organizations hold rallies in favor of justice reinvestment and immigration reform. And what's key about a lot of these, or most of these, is that the youth that are involved in these organizations do the campaign work themselves. And while some activist organizations partner with the state or foundations to fund their work, many actually do not. And that's somewhat of maybe a side point, but it's quite important where you get your funding, because if your funders don't like what you do or what you say, they pull the funding. And there's even quite an interesting book of that title called "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded," right? And there's an important element to that, and that these organizations often try to work, their work is not partnering directly with state agencies, although they do work alongside of them. A second variety of social justice organizations primarily works to prevent youth and gang violence from occurring. So they intervene on harmful behavior and work to reintegrate young people back into community through, usually implementing programs. And these kind of organizations primarily do partner with the state or foundations to deliver services. However, their work is usually centered on this concept of social consciousness. The understanding, just in brief, that the troubles and frustrations that young people experience have causes outside of themselves, that they are rooted in the systematic injustices and deprivations that they experience. And then a third type of organization are those that engage in more advocacy and policy making, and often partnering with the activist social justice organizations. And these kind of organizations coordinate the actions, again, of the other two types, and they often serve in a way as umbrella organizations that bridge grassroots groups working on related issues across a given city or state, or even across the nation. And these type of organizations, although I haven't done extensive research, but they exist in other places, in the places that I brought up earlier. For example, there are similar organizations working in Australia, like one called the Central Australian Aboriginal Legal Aid Services. There are similar organizations in London and Belfast. And so, like, not only are social justice organizations that work around the globe, but many are thinking globally as well, working to bring consciousness to the carceral and economic issues that penetrate the lives of young people around the world. And I feel like these are extremely important, given how interconnected and similar the oppressions are today. And I want to say one thing in terms of the second part of your question with defunding the police. Some of the organizations, well, one of my sort of favorite ones, I guess, I know we're not supposed to have favorites in research, but is in Los Angeles area called the Youth Justice Coalition. And for some time now, they have actually, and it's actually online now, built a, I guess it'd be a sort of an alliance of services that is an alternative emergency phone number. So it's an alternative to 911. So in cases where there's like there's a mental health crisis, a domestic violence crisis, if there's, say, a schoolyard fight, and all kinds of other, I guess minor, or not minor, sorry, that's not the right word, but it's a question if you really want law enforcement there in the first place. There's this alternative, and it's done. It's done at the community level. So social service agents will, respond, or those, like in the psychology realm, even possibly psychiatrists will respond, and not police, right? Because for these communities, the police have become more dangerous than anything else they'll experience. So it's these alternatives that you were starting to see, and that actually fits with this idea of reallocating, what U.S. police should respond to, and I think that's probably right. I mean, we put too much responsibility on the police, where maybe we do want the police in certain occasions, and when we call for someone's breaking into your house, you might want the police to come quite quickly. And in fact, communities that suffered the greatest from, and this is sort of I don't live in a Black community, but I've talked to people who have, and activists that, especially the elders, they want more policing in their community sometimes. But now we've started to see the problem has always been is that their role is too wide, it's too expansive, and I think it's limiting that role. And this is where these social justice organizations are important, because when things, and that's why I started with talking about there was protests and sit-ins and die-ins, and we closed down parts of freeways in Miami, and this was in 2014. These things start to recede a little bit, right? The protests and mobilizations, but these social justice organizations are brick and mortar. They stay there, and they still operate, and they continue their work, and they provide a space to continue the mobilization and the activism, and everything that's necessary to continue this change when the protests and mobilization start to recede. And that's why I feel like, for me, that they're quite an important piece of this, the puzzle for reform.
Thank you. Dr. Peacock, you've witnessed the defunding of police firsthand. How might the defunding experience in Eastern Europe give us some insight into what might be our future? In other words, if you had a magic crystal ball, what are the lessons that we are going to have to face or deal with, especially those who are debating these drastic changes as it relates to U.S. police structure and U.S. police culture?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. As a former consultant, I was actually the project director for actually 2 different countries in East Europe that really had a significant defunding of the police. And by that, again, this term, as Dr. Ammons made clear, it means different things to different users of it. But in the context of Europe, we have to keep in mind that a gold standard of the U.S. Department of Justice oversees efforts to improve policing around the world. A gold standard is defunding the police. Now, not as a means, not as an end goal, but as a means to then do the second portion of that, which is to specifically integrate the community into the process of selecting new police. But this is something, Department of Justice is a large organization primarily focused on domestic issues in the United States, and I was part of a very small office. And actually, at this moment, I've been working with those supporting Armenia in a plan that will actually be even more ambitious than in the countries of Georgia and Ukraine, where I previously was involved in defunding the police. In Armenia, the plan is to liquidate the entire structure of their police apparatus, and to select entirely new officers, and not only have a new selection of officers, including those candidates from existing police, but to reimagine how policing is being done from scratch. Now, in the US context, I still think it's important when you think about a place or several places in the United States where communities simply lack any trust in the police they have. And this is a difficult, as Dr. Goddard mentioned, nothing's more difficult than truly getting answers that will get at the root of a lot of social justice issues. But I think when it comes to police reform and what we can do specifically in policing to make a real difference in those levels of trust inside a community, it's difficult for me to perceive the current toolbox of reforms in the United States as being sufficient. Even, if Minneapolis, which if you asked any policing expert in the country, to name 5 of the most cutting edge and reform-minded agencies, it would probably be, Minneapolis would be on most lists. I mean, they're an agency, they've done most of the available reforms when you talk about the policing side versus the community side. They've done most of the key trainings. They've done unconscious bias training for every officer. They've spent 3 decades on community policing at different divisions, different partners in the public. And they've contracted for social services as second responders. They've worked with mental health responders as part of their police response. So when you consider, and this is not just true in Minneapolis, but many agencies, they've been tinkering with reforms for a considerable amount of time. And I think that in many communities, it will not be sufficient to really address the root issue of distrust. And that's why I believe it is at least important for strategists and reformers in different cities, and most of our police are overseen by municipalities or in some cases counties like in Florida. But it's critical that they look beyond just the existing toolbox and go outside the box, if you will, and look at examples where you're seeing police reform in a different way. And in particular, I want to focus on Ukraine. Former minister there who's actually working with me on Armenia right now, but Yekaterina Zguladze, she was a Georgian who became deputy minister for reform and actually minister of internal affairs, starting at the age of 27. She was a deputy minister, but was a big element in their reform effort, and then went to Ukraine and became deputy minister in order to oversee the proposed reform there. And she has a quote that I want to read. She stated one time, "If you simply turn to the existing police department to select and train an entirely new police force, why would the public trust that new agency will behave any different than the dismissed agency? Regardless of how you rename it or regardless of how you retrain it, it will be very difficult to really make a significant headway on trust with the community." And this is something where in Ukraine and Georgia, and we hope in Armenia starting this fall, the approach has been focused on not just defunding. And here, I'm specifically defunding in the context of the 3 countries I'm using it in. It's primarily a legal issue. You cannot, you've got labor contracts, you have civil service. In Ukraine, we had the ironic situation of a lot of US supported assistance had created a very strong civil service system. And that prevented us from making the reforms we wanted. But by defunding the police, you actually liquidate the agency and say, we no longer need this policing service. We're now switching to, in the American context, maybe a Department of Public Security or Public Safety. And, excuse me.
And how might that be different from our traditional police department?
Well,
This
here,
Department of Public Safety or Security?
right. Again, the name means nothing other than the legal step of being able to basically compete positions again. If you did not liquidate the old and stand up something new, you couldn't void the civil service or labor contract involved. But by doing this, what we did in Ukraine was to open up every position to both previous candidates and new candidates to not only become the new officers, I should add, but also the instructors of those officers and the HR officers who would select future officers. But what you have is a picture here. This is from Kherson, particularly a place where distrust of police is a century old. Not a few years ago, they took over 2 police stations after rapes by officers who thought that they would never face justice. And the towns literally took over the police stations. And it was one of the reasons it was one of the first places out of 31 where a new patrol police was stood up. But it was stood up using civil society as part of the commission to select the officer. So this is a photograph of an interview. This officer would have already gone through the physical, the medical, would have taken a psychological profile, would have passed the or taken a logic test. There was a minimum score. And they would have all those results. And the citizens, in this picture here, you have, not only did we have the 3 outside civil society members, in this particular picture, I recognize the officer that was the head of the commission was actually a newly selected patrol officer from Kiev. He was a professional, I forget, I think engineering or something, and became an officer out of a patriotic fervor of that time following the Maidan revolution. And he was brought down to head up this commission. And then the HR officer was one of the younger, more open-minded, in fact, was one of the tougher interviewers and might have been even more stringent than a lot of our civil society on who he felt was appropriate to be given the privilege of carrying a gun and patrolling the community there. But every community which set up which received the patrol police, they were participants in the selection of those officers. And I think that was a big factor in the rapid increase in trust that we measured after that took place. Over 2015 to 2017, it tripled in the cities that received patrol police. Now, keep in mind that defunding of police in Ukraine, it was really just the patrol police that was stood up in this new manner. Those are the police responding to 911. But for the most part, the old police are in their positions in police stations. The detectives and other elements are still the old police. But this is the model, and this is the model that the Department of Justice and the Department of State are promoting in the region. And Armenia is now going to be the next focus of trying to essentially defund and reimagine policing. But I think, and what I really want to make is my key argument in my response, is that the key element was getting the community in the process of choosing the officers, choosing those officers who would become their trainers, and choosing, by the way, the chief himself. It was an entirely outside panel that made that choice. For the they have a national patrol police, and this is the national chief. And I want to also mention that Canada I looked long and hard for international examples, and Canada comes closest. They have civil society as part of their decisions, part of the commissions that decide promotion. So you're awarded based on the perspective of the community in which you police. And I think in today's world, I think this is a step. It doesn't necessarily have to take place as it did in these countries, but I think there needs to be a step. We're in the U.S. toolbox. We have something called Oversight, public oversight commissions, and Minneapolis has one of the first. And these focus on problems that have already taken place. And I think we need to get civil society involved before the police are even selected to really make an impact on how they perceive the officers patrolling their neighborhood.
Thank you. Dr. Bradford, some of your work has focused on police diversity. I know that you've looked at the importance of police officers living in the areas that they're responsible for patrolling. There seems to be still this overwhelming sense of distrust or mistrust of law enforcement. What are some strategies that our communities can use or that law enforcement personnel can use to help not only restore this lack of trust, but shore up the legitimacy of law enforcement in these communities?
Well, you are exactly right. As a matter of fact, I have an article that's currently under review that looked at Black firearm crime, police trust, and racial diversity, and sort of this notion of self-help. And without mounting my soapbox, becoming too theoretical and or boring, I will seriously condense this. But essentially, self-help is this idea that if people don't trust the police, that they will take the law into their own hands. Kind of this idea of vigilante justice. So citizens that receive less protection, whether that's because of socioeconomic status or because they are a minority, are less likely to trust the police, which means that they are less likely to mobilize the police should something happen. And of course, again, as a person of color, you can kind of understand that. You see all of these news stories. Well, hey, we contacted the police, or I called 911 because my car, not my car, I looked outside because my house was broken into. And the next thing I know, I'm on the ground because they're assuming that I'm breaking into my own home, right? So some things you're just like, do I really want to contact the police? And I think that one thing that definitely would help is if we increased transparency. My research that I did looked at over 150,000 offenders in 113 states in the US. And what I found is that the disparity between Black and whites using gun crime decreased by 67% for every 1 unit increase in police diversity. So I think that we can increase diversity.
Can you break that down a little bit, unpack it for some of our viewers?
Bring it down?
Just a little bit.
I'm too loud.
No, not bring it down, not volume wise. Unpack the,
Oh, okay.
unpack the statistics for our non-statistics oriented listeners, please.
Absolutely. When you said bring it down, I'm like,
no,
oh gosh.
Break it down. Sorry.
Okay. So what that means is, and I don't know about you guys out there, but I'm definitely a visual learner. I'm all things visual. So let's just say, I'm trying to scoot back just a smidgen. My chair's not rolling. It's not cooperating. Okay, we have it. So let's just say that my right hand is Black firearm crime, right? And my left hand is white firearm crime, okay? So we know, research shows that Blacks tend to commit more firearm crime, right? But what I found is that as the racial diversity of a police increased, meaning there were more Black police officers in a given city, that the number of Black officers decreased. So where we had this huge disparity, it's starting to kind of come together. See how I did that? And so when I was doing the research, I'm thinking, okay, so I know, I mean, of course I'm also Black, that there's this history of mistrust. So what can we do? What can we do to bring back legitimacy? So again, I think that we should have more racially diverse police department. And I understand, let me clarify that by saying that that isn't a panacea. That's not a, oh, this is going to magically fix everything, because it's not. But one thing that I believe that can happen is that people may be more trusting, in the sense that when you go somewhere and you see someone that looks like you, and let's say they have similar characteristics, you kind of think, oh man, we probably have some shared experiences. So it's possible that if you see someone that looks like you, that may help to increase trust. When you also, I don't know how familiar our listeners are, our attendees are with this notion of intergroup theory, but a lot of social psychologists have recently looked and said that areas that are more diverse, when there are work groups that are more diverse, it reduces implicit bias, racial anxiety, stereotype threat. And we know that some people just perhaps didn't grow up with someone that looks like them, right? So research shows that there are just some white people that perceive Blacks as more dangerous. So having an opportunity to kind of be in those close circles, so to speak, has the potential, to diminish unconscious bias, increase empathy and inclusion. So we have people that can say, okay, these are some things that perhaps you can do differently. And it gives people the opportunity to be around people of color, which perhaps they may not otherwise be around. If you look, even going back since the civil rights movement, and what we know that, okay, albeit the police force is more diverse, right? So there, it's more diverse racially, ethnically, there are more women, right? But still only about 11% of the police are actually Black, right? Because you go in most communities, people of color, they're not trying to be police. They're trying to be anything but, right? Because there is this distrust. But I believe that if we were to seriously look at hiring more people of color, and not just to say we're ticking it off a box or to make someone our token, or to say, you know what, let me appease the public or let me appease this particular politician, but to say, hey, perhaps we need some more interaction. I believe that would increase trust. Also, going back again to the idea of transparency. One of the things that was probably the most powerful about George Floyd was the fact that it was undeniable, right? Because before, you've heard people say, well, what were all the circumstances? All right, if they would have just followed the law, you can see, and from multiple angles, this whole thing unfold. So I do believe that increasing transparency, so things like body cams, where everyday citizens can say, okay, this is what happened, right? Because it's one thing if you have a history of mistrust. Let's be honest, if you don't trust someone, you're not going to take their word for it. Like the reading Rainbow LeVar, you don't have to take my word for it. Don't worry, most people they're not. So great. But it gives, like I said, everyday citizens an opportunity to see, okay, this is actually what happened, and just in everyday life, I think we need to do a better job of being transparent. So I think that transparency definitely would help increase law legitimacy, having more diversity. And again, true diversity, not in the sense of, well, let me just say I'm bringing you in just so I can click you off a box, but bringing those people in. And also not just bringing those people in, but allowing them to say, hey, to give some buy-in, and to take those, when the people of color that are law enforcement agents have issues, actually taking the time to address those issues and not sweeping them under the rug. Because, you know, if you have these people you have Black people and they're police officers, but they, you know, they're still hearing their colleagues use racial slurs, and, you know, they're still seeing these injustices, or they're in fear that if they say something about police brutality, that they may potentially lose their jobs. You know, we have to not only increase the diversity, but value the people that are there. And I think in doing so, we could see, or I'm hopeful, right? I'm anyone that knows me, I'm ridiculously optimistic anyways, just in general. But I'm at least hopeful that it will inspire other Black and brown people to say, you know what? I want to be a police because I want to make a difference. That's something I hope our students want to do and want to see. So obviously we have a long way to go, right? But by showing that we really care, and by increasing transparency, I do think that it would increase trust.
Thank you. We spend a lot of our time talking about policing specifically. Dr. Goddard, I'm going to pull you back into the conversation now. The rates of incarceration for Blacks and Browns are astounding in the United States. And you just told us a little while ago that 1 in 3 Black men will spend some point of their lives under some form of correctional supervision. Can you shed some light on the rates of incarceration for these groups in other industrialized nations? Is the United States completely different from what we see across the globe, or are we falling are we following what our peers, if you will, are also doing?
Yeah, I think with just as a little sidebar is that, you know, as we think about policing and the policing in the U.S., you know, I mean, that's obviously the face of the law and, you know, the criminal justice system. But what stands behind that is obviously the you know, behind police, in addition to courts, is our jail and prisons, right? And of course, you know, most people know at this point now, right, that, you know, the U.S. is the world's leader in incarceration, right, with 2.2 million people currently in the nation's jails, prisons and jails. And so even though we've had a 9% decrease since the levels in 2009, this follows a nearly 700% growth in the prison population between 1972 and 2009, right? And that's why we call it mass incarceration. But let me just highlight the racial disparities again. Rigo, will you put up my first slide? Actually, the other one. Here we go. There you go. Right. So as we can see here, I mean, I'm a visual thinker. You know, more than 60% of the people in the prison today are people of color. Right? Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and Hispanic men are 2.7 times as likely. And you can see on the top right side there, people in state and federal prisons by race and ethnicity. Just even the numbers itself, there are more, you know, Black people in state and federal prisons than white or Hispanic, right? I mean, it's a massive disparity, just in the numbers. And then when we look at the rate, which is obviously a much better, you know, measure to compare, you can see how astonishing and that it is for Black men in the U.S., right? Having an incarceration rate of 2,336 per 100,000. And then, as you can see there, with Latino men, it's just over 1,000 per 100,000 people. With white men, roughly around 400 per 100,000. And then you see a similar trend, although as not as extreme, but with Black women, Latino women, and white women. And I just want you to, before I'm going to move on to another slide, to start to think about where the U.S. Falls, or how we compare to the rest of the world. But just remember this number, especially with Black men, right? The 2,336 per 100,000, right? That's our rate. Rigo, please go to the other slide. So here's how we compare to the rest of the world, right? The US being, we've actually had a decline recently, as I mentioned. At one point we were up to 712 per 100,000, right? So that was, the rate was above, beyond there, that's that endpoint of 700. And you can see the US is followed by El Salvador, Rwanda, Russia, Brazil. And then, when you start to get into these lower, these other countries, you can see they have rates well below 200. Many of them, I always kind of look at France, right? We have at 100 people incarcerated per 100,000. Obviously Canada, just being our neighbor, right, is just over 100 people, right? So this is what mass incarceration is. And we're the world's leader in incarceration, but, not just barely winning, right? We're like leading the way by far, right? And look at, if you think now, what I asked you to look at, or remember that number of the incarceration rate of Black men, look where that would lie on this, this graph, right? How many graphs would I need to get to almost, what, 2,400? So you would need to put, just to try to visualize 4 of these next to each other, right? 4 of these graphs. And then we can put at the very top the incarceration rate of Black men. And then on the 4th one over, we would get the rate, right? So it's astounding. It's literally off the charts. And then even think how that compares to, say, France or Canada, right? With such small rates, or Denmark, 50 people per 100,000, right? So these are, these are the rates. And this is what we're faced with. So of course, policing is obviously, like, vitally important to change, but there's, the system really runs deep, and in Black communities, it runs, very, very deep, and it needs, to reform. The reforms are going to take a lot more than even just the conversation that we're having now, although absolutely should be having these conversations, but there's more. I also want to point out a really interesting study to sort of really get the nuances, because the United States is quite unique, just with its 50 states. But the Prison Policy Initiative, they did an innovative report in 2018 that helps to really look at the numbers in a global way. So what they did is that, imagine every US state, so all 50 states, as an independent nation, right? So, Florida, the country of Florida, the country of California, et cetera, right? And what they found by doing that is that the incarceration rate of every state appears extreme. So 23 states would have again, as if they were nations, or if you consider them countries, and then you look at their incarceration rate and then compare that to the rest of the world, 23 states would have the highest incarceration rate in the world, right? So they would be 23 states, and then the first nation below, the 24th, which actually is the US as a country, which, and then that's where the US stands, right? I think it's Oklahoma is #1, so their incarceration rate is just under 1,100 per 100,000. So just the state of Oklahoma. Louisiana, I believe, is second. And so Massachusetts, the state with the lowest incarceration rate in the nation, when on this, thinking about it in these ways, if it was its own state, the country of Massachusetts, would rank 9th in the world, right? Which would be just below Brazil, and followed closely by countries like Belarus, Turkey, Iran, and South Africa. So to quote the Prison Policy Initiative's report, many of the countries that rank alongside the least punitive US states, such as Turkmenistan, Thailand, Rwanda, and Russia have authoritarian governments or have recently experienced large-scale internal armed conflict. Others struggle with violent crime on a scale far beyond that in the US. Right? El Salvador, Russia, Panama, Costa Rica, Brazil all have murder rates more than double that of the US. Yet the US, and I'm quoting, land of the free, tops them all. Rigo, if you can go to my next slide. So when we look at states like Florida, right, with the incarceration rate even higher than the US average, right, compare even worse, right, next to other stable democracy, or next to other stable democracies, Florida is off the charts, right? So even in Florida, we see this mass incarceration and how unique and, really sort of mind-blowing our incarceration rate, not just as a country, but by individual states, compared to other, sort of similar countries of the US, like a UK or Canada or France, right? So again, although there's serious talk about change, upending this system will take a lot of effort. And, the change must happen to many parts of the system. As I tell my students, whatever area of the criminal justice system that you might end up working in, make it an effort to push for reform, regardless of how small, as it will take many people working in and out of the system to make the necessary changes.
Thank you. As we rapidly approach the end of our time together, I'd like to give each of you a few minutes to give us some parting wisdom. Dr. Blanford.
Yes. I'm sorry, my nose is a bit runny. I will just say this. I will keep it succinct. I tend to say that and then talk for like 45 minutes, but I'm not going to do that. I think as a final thought, so to speak, I think we need to continue having discussions like these, right? And Dr. Goddard alluded earlier that, just a moment ago, he talked about, hey, it's not just, of course, we tend to right now be focused on police, but it's this entire system, right, that needs to be addressed, that needs reform. But I don't think anything will happen of any importance if we don't keep it at the forefront and continue to discuss and continue to talk. And I understand that, we have a long history here. So this is something that's not going to happen over a day or a year or a week, certainly not with an hour and a half. We can't, completely change the criminal justice system. But I believe that each time we engage in meaningful dialogue and we discuss those things that perhaps may be uncomfortable to some, we move a little bit closer towards correcting the justice system. So if I would leave the viewers with anything, it would be, one, keep the conversation going, and I know we've been bombarded with all of these images and all of these facts. And I know I've become overwhelmed. So I'm sure others have become overwhelmed as well. So you may have to take a day or two break to kind of, reset, but continue to research, continue to read, continue to learn, continue to identify ways in which the criminal justice system needs to change and be a part of that solution. And as Dr. Goddard said, and for many of our students, that looks different depending on where they're planning to go within that apparatus. But one thing we all can do is to continue the discussion. And then in addition to continuing the discussion, work to educate ourselves, on the criminal justice system, on perhaps what another person's experiences may be that are different from ours, because then we're able to learn, we're able to empathize. And I just said two, and now I'm acting like a preacher and giving you a third, but this is the last final one, I promise you. I would say number 3 would be to taking that whole idea of intergroup theory, learning to appreciate and value diversity and see it as a tool for us to move together in unity as opposed to something that can divide us. I'm done.
Dr. Peacock. I think we might have lost Dr. Peacock. So Dr. Goddard, please.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep mine. Hopefully we'll get Dr. Peacock back, but you know, I'll keep mine short as well. You know, for me, if I'm, you know, speaking to students, you know, I teach about this stuff. I teach the policy courses, and I talk a lot about this. And sometimes students get actually somewhat inspired by it, that they want to actually become, you know, prosecutors or defense attorneys because they want to, you know, work against these injustices within the system. And I think that's great. Whereas others, they're like, well, I don't want to go in the criminal justice system now. And I really try to steer them back. I really do, because I mean, I think, you know, having, you know, being armed with, you know, I guess the research, the numbers, and, you know, what we know is going on, and having that passion to change it, you know, we can have, you know, very like enlightened students going out there and working in the system, and you know, not to expect to, as individuals on their own, to have change everything, but if everybody's working, you know, is on what they can control in their, you know, daily, you know, operation in a position, and the work that they do, with, you know, whether it's coming, if they're in law enforcement, when they, you know, come across like, you know, groups of young men of color, and the way they would handle these situations, and, you know, differently, or you know, intervene. I think we've heard a lot about that with policing, like why is no one intervening, you know? And it's true, because you know, some things have come up where, when I know there was a case where, and of course I don't remember where it is because we're, you know, getting bombarded with a lot of different information, but a black police officer intervened on a white police officer who was, you know, hurting a black man, and the next day she was fired, you know. So obviously that's anecdotal, and it's a one case, but you know, nevertheless, you know, having our students go out in the world, you know, and knowing that and believing that they can make a difference, because I really do think they can, is something that I, you know, want to continue to encourage. And you know, we're as faculty members, like, we're here to support you. And then as my last sort of point, I want to, you know, whatever area of the criminal justice system, again, speaking to our students, you know, whatever area of the criminal justice system you work in, like, if you always have this idea in your mind, and I'm going to quote Justice Thurgood Marshall, right, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice of the United States, and for me, one of the greatest thinkers of all time, and to quote him, "Where you see wrong or inequality or injustice, speak out, because this is your country, this is your democracy. Make it, protect it, pass it on."
Thank you. Dr. Peacock.
Yeah, I lost you guys for a little bit, so it's perfect timing. I want to I actually second what you've already heard for closing remarks, and just make sure you, as young scholars and older scholars and those trying to affect change, they look outside the American box. And I think Dr. Goddard's earlier discussion of you know, to what degree, what are the alternatives that other countries use to lower their incarceration rate, is a good example of, we've got to look outside what we know when you're reimagining law enforcement. And I'll throw out two more ideas similar, because frankly, his presentation reminded me of three things that police officers in Europe constantly looked at me with eyes that couldn't understand. How is it possible, you know, this incredulity at how the US system had so many incarcerated? How can they pay for so many penitentiaries when they could have Penn States instead? But also two other things. The United States, and really North America, stands out for being the only countries that have a use of force continuum, what's used for training and decision-making of officers, that only has one lethal threat option, which is shoot to kill, shoot for torso. The rest of the world shoots to wound as an option in the continuum. And this is an emotional issue. I've had some very well thought, very thoughtful and intelligent officers provide logical reasons why you need to shoot to kill sometimes, and that if you miss an arm or a leg, that an innocent victim can die either from your bullet or the suspects. But that doesn't change the reality, particularly reality today. The juries will put you away for life if they don't agree with the logic, and it doesn't matter what the training continuum had. And in today's world, I think it's in the interest of police reform to get a use of force continuum that goes beyond just shoot to kill. And the last thing, and one that comes to mind recently, because when I talk about the Minneapolis incident, the homicide of Floyd in Minneapolis, Americans never raise something that always seems to come up with my European discussions, and that is they find it impossible to understand how the main officer, this Chauvin, who was was obviously immortalized and now is this kind of demonic look in the eyes and committing this homicide. How could this person have worked till 2 and 3 in the morning at nightclubs? It's that a society chooses to give a weapon and chooses to empower to make decisions about coercion and taking life to a group of people that only 1 out of 3 agencies in this country even regulate what officers do in uniform with their weapon for moonlighting activities. And for the rest of the world, or much of the world, particularly the European part, it's completely incomprehensible. At one time, officers made half of what a teacher makes. Today, they are professionals. They're paid more than teachers. And if you're going to be professional, if you're going to be treated as a professional, we have to have a more grown-up approach to those issues. So I just want to end by saying, expand the horizons and where you look to reimagine policing, because I think we have a tendency to look in the same box, and you tend to get the same results when you do that.
On behalf of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and the Master of Arts in Global Affairs program, I want to thank our esteemed panelists, Dr. Candace Ammons-Blanford, Dr. Tim Goddard, Dr. Robert Peacock, for joining us today. Each has given us insight into the impact of race on criminal justice systems, both here and abroad. And though we've made significant strides, the lesson here is that there's still an extraordinary amount of work to do. Good night, everyone, and be safe.